Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to episode number 34 of the S.O.M podcast. I just wrapped up a call with Lewellyn, and it's, guys, like, you're gonna like this one. He's the author of Christ in the Fog, subtitled Journey Through Life's Fog to Uncover Soul Wounds and Begin an Existential Process of Renewal. And he's someone who's struggled with some mental health issues, who's noticed mental health issues in the church, and we have a really good conversation about how that's affected him, and then we also go into some very practical advice on how can you deal with it if it's something you're struggling with, and also how can you help people who you love who are struggling with mental health issues or feel anxious or have depression, anything along those lines. How can we help people, and how can we improve our own situations if that's something we struggle with? It's definitely a problem that we've both experienced in the church, and we've noticed by other people in the church, so I really believe this is going to be a super valuable podcast for you. I hope it is, and without further ado, here's episode number 34 with Lewellyn. Lewellyn, welcome to the S.O.M podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, it's good to chat. I've read a bit of your book. You've written the book Christ in the Fog, Journey Through Life's Fog to Uncover Soul Wounds and Begin an Existential Process of Renewal. Before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you came from, why you wrote this book, and just a bit about your story?
Yeah, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s in Connecticut in the United States, and now I live in Indiana. And I grew up in a Christian home. I went to a Christian college. Then I actually went to the seminary after that. I was training to be in the ministry. And then I graduated with my Master of Divinity, of all things, in 2009, and promptly went to work full-time as a software developer. And then I met and married my wife. Now we have a few kids and a dog and a nice life here in Indiana. But what I wrote the book for is in my late teens and then going into my 20s, especially in the time I was in the seminary, I had this persistent feeling that something was wrong with my faith, that I wasn't really living up to what the expectations were around me, especially in a format like a seminary where everybody's just like uber Christian, right? So, yeah, I ended up in this place where I kind of had to sort that out. Like, why was I feeling like I was less than? Why was I a second-class Christian to all these people? I was putting in the same kind of work and doing a lot of the same kinds of things. I was quite functional in that way, but I was also hurting in that my experience wasn't living up to the same standard I was seeing around me. And it took quite a while to sort that out, that nagging notion. And that my book came out of that. So it's a journey through meditations of the functional hurting is what I call it, where we're all people that can kind of go to work, we can pay our taxes, we can go to church, we can interact with our families, right? And yet there's something in the background, this nagging, persistent notion of either anxiety or depression. There are Christians all over the world that are dealing with addictions. There are Christians who are dealing with traumatic pasts, or just loss in the present, like losing a loved one, losing a career, losing, these various things that we rely on for our daily lives. So I was walking through that and then trying to come to a place where I could put down some meditations on scriptures that walk somebody through what does it look like to kind of rebuild after all of this. And knowing that this is my experience, maybe it goes away in the future, maybe it doesn't, but the experience is what it is. And then we can walk through scriptures and kind of come to a new understanding of what Christ has for us in this life and beyond.
Yeah, man, that's a great thing to talk about. And you obviously, when you go to church, you don't realize how many people are actually hurting or how many people are struggling with something. And when you start to get a few close friends and start to have some actually like deep conversations, it's not something I've experienced this with one person, but actually most people I talk to probably have those sorts of experiences in church, especially when you want to go to church and act like you have everything under control. In reality, most people don't. Most people are struggling with an addiction or mental health issues or all sorts of things that being airy-fairy about it on a Sunday and pretending like everything's all good isn't probably the best approach for everyone. So your main topic is you talk in your book about the fog a lot. It's in the title of your book. It's in pretty much every chapter of the book. Why don't you tell us what you're referring to specifically about that and how that applies to people?
So the fog is really kind of if you think about like you're driving around on a foggy morning, you have this cloudy mist that's settled over you, low visibility, you can't really see a whole lot, and it's easy to get disoriented. So we're straining our eyes, and then because we're so focused on trying to see what's around us, we start missing signs, we start missing details because we're just trying to see that next little bit of road in front of us. So then you take that image and superimpose it, if you will, over your soul and see the effects that are there for just every area of life. So my book takes us through a number of vignettes that's just trying to put us in that fog experience. It's like dropping you right into that world and seeing the fog around you. What do you see? What do you hear? How do you react to it? And it's just trying to draw out these things that are kind of under the surface in our souls, bring them to the surface where we can actually deal with it. We're experiencing these things like we might be feeling anxiety, and it's just this urge to run away, where we feel overwhelmed by just how many voices are coming at us in this world of the internet, social media, and the 24/7 news cycle and everything else, not to mention all of the Christian voices that come at us, even in churches, in so many different ways of following Jesus, it seems, and so many ideas of how to study the Bible better, how to pray better, how to get better results in your Christian life. There's so many voices. So psychologically, this can come out as depression. It can come out as anxiety. It could be that trauma response, depending on what is going on in your past, your family of origin. But the other thing to mention, Paul, is that it can be hard to feel like part of a group. It can be hard to get a sense of belonging where being a Christian and going to church, right? That's all about being in that community of Jesus and being this one body, to be the hands and feet of Jesus on this earth. But it can be hard to feel like you're part of that group and like you're having this trouble hearing God's voice when everybody else in the room is hearing God's voice, right. Feeling hard to pray when everybody else in the room can pray. And so it's those sorts of experiences, that disorientation, that not really knowing where to go next. That is the fog.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And you brought up not being able to hear God's voice when other people do, or like along that lines. And I think there's probably something a lot of people, like this is probably something I'm going through right now. And that's hard. And a lot of people would see that as like, what am I doing wrong? Am I not Christian enough? And you start to compare yourself with other people. There's actually this really good book. I don't know what you think about John Bevere, but he's got this book about Into the Wilderness. Oh, sorry. No, it's like God, Where Are You? It's talking about wilderness seasons. And that's kind of like the vibe. So I won't go too much into that, but if someone's struggling with that, that's honestly like changed my whole perspective about how I see and understand that. But yeah, I think I bring that up because you mentioned that, and that's not something that just you struggle with or something that I've struggled with or am struggling with. That's actually like really common, and a lot of people have that. And so if someone's listening to this, I don't want them to think that they're the only one. And basically everyone I talk to have experienced that at some point, and or are experiencing that. And that's a totally like super common thing that people have. Before we start to go into some practical advice on how we can improve our situations, do you want to talk a little bit about your story? And I guess you have a little bit, but is there anything else you want to add to how you've experienced the fog and what you've done about it, how it's affected you? Feel free to go as deep or as shallow about that as you want to go. But when I say that, like, what do you think about what comes to your head?
What I'd share is, stepping through the fog on my own has been a journey of learning how to be more honest with God. I can't really just go to God and be like, hey, I went to Christian college. I went to seminary. I was raised in a Christian home. I attend church every Sunday. I do evangelism. I do discipleship. None of that really matters when I'm sitting before God and I'm just thinking, hey, I just can't feel what's going on. Like I'm not getting anything out of this Bible passage I'm reading. It's supposed to be thought provoking. It's supposed to be spiritually uplifting, and I just got nothing, man. And
Right.
it's had to be a journey of being honest with God, that looking around me and just seeing, very few people in the church are talking about mental health issues. And maybe that's part of my story. Maybe that's part of a lot of people's story. I mean, you look around at the statistics, and over 1 out of 5 people, I'm not sure exactly how the statistics match up in New Zealand and that part of the world, but here in America, 1 out of 5 people has struggled with mental wellness. And
Right.
that's typically underreported, right? So there's going to be more people out there than just that. So I look around, but I didn't really understand that I wasn't alone. And so in a lot of ways, you kind of feel alone. You kind of have this picture in your mind of stumbling through the fog. So it took me a long time to actually start writing about it and to start talking about it. And once I did, then I started to realize how many more people were out there with the same kinds of experiences, who suffered with the same types of anxiety or questions that would come up in their minds that they just wouldn't know how to deal with it. So we try to approach Jesus in a more honest way, with the goal is rebuilding our neural pathways in our brains. Like, our brains are these complex network of neurons and things like that. And we all kind of become addicted to a certain way of being because we have these paths set in our minds and in our brains, and our brains keep firing the same way. So we keep doing the same things the same way. And we keep stepping through life the same way. We have our daily routine and everything else. So what we're trying to do is rebuild that. So the entire second half of my book is just stepping through different scriptures and trying to do that with that level of honesty that we can bring to the table. For example, one of them is from Hebrews chapter 2, where it talks about Jesus not being ashamed of his brethren. And it's taking that concept, you're like, okay, well, why am I ashamed to be what I am? Why do I feel less than when I'm in the church? Why is it that my voice may be stopped when everyone else is singing? Why my voice may be silent when everyone else is praying? And the fact is, Jesus, the highest being in the universe, is not ashamed to call me his brother. How do I know that? Well, because the Bible says it, and I believe that. Even though I may not feel it every day of my life, it is still true. And he's not scared by my experience. He's not coming to me saying, well, I'll just deal with you, Matt, when you get your crap together and you don't feel like this anymore.
Right.
So it's a journey of coming to that honesty and learning to put those things in front of me and saying, here's what I am. Here's what my experience is, no matter how dark it may be. And this is written out here for Christians who go through their lives with these experiences, who experience that chronic anxiety or depression, who can, it goes as far as like suicidal ideation or addictions. All of these things are things that Christians can experience. They need to know that they're not alone. They need to know that Jesus is not ashamed to call them his brothers, his sisters.
Yeah, nice. I don't know what your experience has been like, but I think with honesty, I've noticed, aside from God, just talking to people, I don't like talking about my emotions. I don't want to bring it up. Like, if I'm annoyed, like, I'm good. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. But then what I also do is I do the same thing to God, which is stupid. Like, it doesn't make any sense. He already knows how I'm feeling. And I'll go to pray. I'll be like, God, like, I'm good. Just pray for a good day, But actually, like, there's stuff going on in my life that I should take to God. But I take that same approach to God that I take to regular people and just pretend like everything's all good when it probably isn't all the time, right? And I don't know if that's more of a problem for guys than it is for women. I know guys often don't like to talk about their emotions. I don't know what your experience has been, but there's something I've noticed about myself, which is something that I do naturally, but it actually doesn't make sense. Is that something you notice talking to other guys about this or anything?
Oh yeah. And this is something that's just really culturally set in as an expectation for guys in particular, that, we don't have problems. We don't talk about emotions. We don't talk about feelings. We're not supposed to be seen crying in public, that kind of stuff. And what that does in your brain is that kind of makes two sides to you, and it splits you a bit, where you've got this one piece that's real. It's like, this is what's going on in your soul, and it feels all those things, but you have another side of you that's what you think is fit for public consumption, that, this is the side that I want to present to the world. And we try to curate that. We try to make it as attractive as possible. People don't post everything on social media. They only post what they think people will actually appreciate, and click that like button and subscribe and all that stuff. And it's certainly a cultural expectation. There's a book out there called Jesus and John Wayne that goes into some of that, where the church as a whole has this complex of masculinity that has to match what that charisma and machismo that John Wayne had as a movie icon in the 20th century. And that's a very real problem in the church, that we have this idea, instead of promoting a more complete self that actually puts everything that's part of you out on the table and says, this is what I am. You have to deal with me this way. Instead, it really makes you have to work on this image that you want to put up instead of just being who you really are.
Yeah, nice. To get practical, I want to break this down into two sections. One for people who are struggling with this, or one who have people, loved ones, or people close to them who are struggling with mental health issues within the church and everything. Why don't we start with people who are struggling with mental health, or feel like they feel the fog in their lives? What have you noticed in your own life, or with people you've talked to? How can people practically improve their situation and help them get through this?
So the best way to improve the situation, from my experience and from the people I've talked to, is to take it day by day. You really kind of have to slow down to speed up there, because you may make some steps in a direction that you think is positive for a while, but then something will go on in your mind, or in your emotional well-being, or in just how your brain chemistry works, and things will kind of slide off onto another level for a while. And that's just part of the reality of what it means to live with issues of mental health and well-being. That the road is not always going to take you upward, but you kind of have to learn to trust the process, and you have to learn to put trusted people around you who kind of know you and know what kind of thing you're going through, in order to just maintain an even keel for that. So that's number one. You kind of have to establish that baseline and be able to take things day by day. Once you have that, you can start trying some more of these types of meditations of coming to scriptures. And it doesn't really matter what scripture it is you're coming to, as long as you are perfectly honest about it. It's not just, okay, what did I learn 10 years ago in Sunday school when this came up? It's, what am I feeling right now? How am I reacting to this story in the Bible, or what happened there, or what the results were for the people involved? And just getting a real handle on, why am I reacting this way? What's next? How is that different from how I think I should react? Why do I think I should react that way? And try to settle that difference and bring those two parts of myself together, instead of continuing to drive them apart. It's a very real thing, Paul, that when we have a negative reaction to something that's in the Bible, we can really start to just try to silence that voice and make it go away. But in order to promote that wholeness of self, we really need to allow that voice to go forward. It doesn't really matter if it's right or wrong at that point. We can settle that out later, right? But it has to be heard in order for those parts of ourselves to come together. Yep. So the other thing I would say is, in terms of having people around you, is I would really suggest having a trusted therapist who really knows what's going on and can take some of those steps from that more psychological and social point of view to bring you into a place where you're moving forward. Because they have training, they have empathy, they have methods that have been shown to be effective, and that's a very helpful way to move forward.
Yeah. I think those are some very great tips. I think a therapist is definitely something that is undervalued, especially for Christians. People are like, well, take it to God, I'm fine, like whatever. But I think therapists are like, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Therapists are definitely like, that's literally what they studied for. Like that's what they do. I think that's great. I wanted to go back for your second point. You talked about when you read a scripture and you meditate on it, you have all these questions like, how do I think about this sort of thing? I'm wondering practically, what does that look like for you? Is that something you just think about in your head? Is that something you journal about? Do you have any sort of system with that, or is that just something you think about in your head?
I do not have a system, and I'll tell you why. Is because every time I've had a system, it's let me down. So and that's because my systems are devised when I'm in a particular mindset. I've got a particular focus that I'm going for, and I can be pretty driven that way, right? But like I said, at some point something happens and that all kind of slides off to the side. One of the images I use in my book is it's like the floor tilts on you, because I used to a family member used to have a house where one of the corners of the house had settled significantly, so that one of the rooms was kind of at a particular slant. And if you weren't careful, you'd be falling downhill as you walked through the room. And the way I was thinking about it, I was like, hey, that's kind of what this is like sometimes. It's, you're going along just fine, and then the next day you get up and it's like, oh, the floor is tilted differently today. I don't know what's going on. So I don't really trust systems that I come up with, but it is just it's trying to stay in the present with what you're looking at in a passage. Because a lot of us can really just rely on what's in the past. We're like, I've learned this passage before. I already know it. I don't really need to read it again, or that sort of thing. Like, we all know the story of Jonah, and we all know how, he, went away from God and then went to Nineveh to preach after God really dragged him out of the whale and all that. He messed up by walking away from God. Yeah. We all know that. That's kind of the point of the story, and then we can just move on. But no, we need to come back to it in the present and kind of think, okay, how am I reacting to this story right now? What's my baseline of emotions right now? How am I processing this in the present, so that I can take that to Jesus and be like, okay, here's who I am right now, not what did I learn 10 years ago about this, but what is it right now that's going on in my soul that I can deal with now?
A lot of the second part of your book and what you've talked about in this podcast already is talking about meditating on scripture. Is that what you're talking about? Like, how do I feel about this? How do I process about this? Well, not, that doesn't, how do I process this?
A lot of Christians just kind of take a historical approach to the scripture where it's, we need to figure out what it means and then apply that to our lives. And I'm all for that. I think that all scripture has a meaning that we really need to find out, that the authors wrote something and the Holy Spirit wrote something through them, that there is a truth, capital T, truth, that needs to be brought out of the text and applied to our lives. But the way that we go about doing that can be vastly different between, a lot of different Christians and practices. So what we really need to do is bring ourselves to the text and kind of almost like submit ourselves to the text. Be like, okay, what's going on in my soul right now? And that's where the meditative part comes in. It's like it's not something you just flip on and off like a light bulb. You kind of have to sit down there for a while and be like, I'm becoming aware that something is going on here, that I'm reacting in this way. Like I said, a lot of our negative emotions about it, we'll suppress those. We'll try to silence those. And so we really need to kind of give it time in order for us to come to the text and actually be honest with what we're feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are some super great tips on where people can get started with people who are struggling with this. What about if we have someone in our lives who we love or is very close to us? How can we support them along this journey?
So the thing to know is we have to understand that a lot of the people we come into contact with are going to be experiencing these kinds of things. They're going to be the ones that, we look around in church and we don't know who they are right on the face of it, right. Because they may be participating fully. They may be, we may see them as expressive or things like that. And they may be compensating for something that's going on. So we don't know when we walk up to somebody, whether they're experiencing this fog or not, or even if they are, how long have they been there? So we have to understand that people are going to have their guard up about it. They may not want to talk about the fog right away. They may not want to open that level of vulnerability because, quite frankly, they may have done so in the past and they may have been hurt before. So we need to be aware of the kinds of things that could be out there. We need to be aware of the kinds of messages that we're speaking, especially in a church setting where we're establishing expectations, right, for how people are meeting Jesus. If we start going out there with a message like, hey, come to Jesus and your anxiety will go away. Well, we got to wait a minute on that, right? We got to back up off that there and realize that, hey, it may have worked that way for you. Doesn't mean it's going to work that way for everybody. And we could be setting people up for more of that feeling less than, which will come out in their hearts as shame that we don't want them to feel, that they shouldn't have to feel. So we have to be considerate of what our messages are. We have to be a little more empathetic in understanding what are people going to hear when they walk into the room. And then for those of us that we know someone is going through something like the fog, we can really just check in with them from time to time to see how they're doing. We don't want to put a lot of pressure there. We don't want to really try to spur them on and just get out of it as soon as possible. We have to allow the process to continue. And that process is going to be different for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's great, especially when you say, "Hey, come to church and all your stuff will go away," and then it doesn't go away, and they're like, "Well, now there's something wrong with me. What's wrong with me?" And so, I believe God's a God of miracles, but also God's the author. Like He's got His timing and He's got a plan, and that's not the same for everyone. And so I think that's a great thing you just said. If people could have, like, whether it's for people struggling with this or people who love someone who's struggling with this, if there's one takeaway, if there's one thing that's the most important, if they forget everything from this podcast, if they want to take one thing that they can apply to their life, what do you think is the most important thing that they can take away from this podcast?
The most important thing I would want someone to take away from this podcast is that Jesus is not ashamed to call anyone who follows him his brother and his sister. Even though we have this internal voice sometimes that tells us that we are less than, that we're second class, that we don't really belong, the Bible is quite clear and Jesus is quite clear that what God gives us is the reason that Jesus is not ashamed to know us is because we all share the same Father, and that's it. There's nothing about our performance in that equation. That's from Hebrews 2, chapter 2, verse 11. There's nothing about our performance in that equation. It's just we can give ourselves permission to explore this fog, to live out our lives, because that takes the pressure off. Because our fog experience, that's not making Jesus ashamed of us.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely a great takeaway, and I want to honor you for everything you're doing with this book. Obviously, I've never written a book, and it's probably not easy. It probably takes a lot of time, and you've taken things that have been a struggle for you in your life, and you're using it. You're taking something that hasn't been something nice in your life, and you're using it for good, and you're using it to help other people, and especially even just judging by your reviews on your book, like you're changing people's lives and you're helping people on their journey, and I thank you for that. Mental health is obviously something that people struggle with a lot more than people want to realize or people want to admit. It's definitely a big problem for a lot of people, even in church, even people who love God, even people who believe in God. It's still an issue for a lot of people, and so I think what you're doing is amazing. So thank you for that. Do you want to wrap this up with, speaking of that, do you want to wrap this up with some rapid fire questions?
Yeah, sure.
Nice. So I've only got a few, but it's just a good way to sort of see where you're like, where you get your knowledge from and everything. What's your favorite book or author or anything along those lines?
My favorite authors would be, my favorite book would be The Relational Soul by a guy named Rich Plass. That really talked about how our souls kind of interact together, and we can really affect the people around us just by our presence, even above what we talk about and the way that we communicate. So that was a very helpful book. The other one I would put out there is Henry Nouwen's book Here and Now, where he talks a lot about being present and just staying in the present and not allowing those past things and those future anxieties to really impinge upon what we have going on in our souls right here and now.
Yeah, they sound great. I don't know how much of a podcast person you are. Do you have a favorite podcast that you listen to?
The one that really resonated with me that I listened to last year was called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It was a production by Christianity Today by Mike Cosper. And that podcast went for, I don't know, it might have been around 15 episodes, but just talking about a huge megachurch in Seattle, Washington, which had thousands of people in it. But it really fell on hard times because of some character issues and some bad decisions by leadership. But it's a very real working through of how that affected the people who were left and what the spiritual effects were, what the emotional effects were. And it was a very honest look at that, and I appreciated that.
Nice. Yeah, this is an interesting question. If you could have anyone as a mentor... Oh, my camera turned off. Hold on. Edit this part out. This is... I was gonna mention to you, but I forgot to. This is my first time using a proper camera for a podcast. And so I thought I had all the... Well, I think I do have all the settings. Maybe it's just after half an hour. But... Okay, there we go. Edit that part out. Okay, so this was one of the interesting questions. If you could have any mentor, dead or alive, anyone in the world, except for Jesus, that doesn't count because obviously that's probably the obvious answer. Who would you have?
Wow, that's a.
And this could be any area of your life. It doesn't have to be like a Christian figure. It can be, but just anyone in your life who you'd have as a mentor.
The first one that comes to my mind would be Thomas Edison. Just to have that idea of no matter how many times you fail at something, you're just going to keep trying again.
Right. That's one has never came up before. That's interesting. We've had a lot of George Washingtons or Abraham Lincolns or past American presidents, but that's one we've never had before. So congrats on that. You're first for Thomas Edison. Matt, I think what you've talked about today has been super amazing. I think it's going to help a lot of people, and I think it's super practical, but also based in past experience. Hey guys, I'm just jumping in from the future, and it turns out for some reason my mic just stopped recording for this last part. So basically, hope you enjoyed the episode. I basically from this point just asked Matt where you can learn more about him and where you can find his book. So here you go.
So my book is on Amazon. It's also on other booksellers. It's available for publication through just about any bookseller at this point. The book is Christ in the Fog, Meditations of the Functional Hurting. I have it in print and ebook form. You can also go to my website at foglife.net FOGLIFE.net. I have a blog there as well that I keep posting to, that's also on in more bite-sized portions of what I've been talking about, just kind of taking one concept at a time and just digging into it a bit. There's a few chapters of the book that are up there on that site for free that anyone can take and look at. And you can find some more information on me there as well.
Hey, thanks so much for checking out this week's episode of the S.O.M podcast. I hope it brought you as much value as it did to me. And if you did enjoy it, I'd really appreciate if you could leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to this. It really helped more ambitious Christians just like yourself all around the world get some of this knowledge that we discussed today. Also, if you'd like to dive deeper into any of the topics we discussed today, I've actually got a free private Facebook group that is filled with people just like yourself, people who are trying to achieve their God dreams, that you can head over. The link will be in the show notes or in the description below, and go check that out. Anyway, guys, hope you have a great day. I'll be back here next time, same place, next week, and I'll see you guys there. Peace out.